Hi, everyone. Ariana here with Rosabella Consulting, and welcome to the Co-Creators in Conversation interview series, where we celebrate leaders who are challenging the status quo and creating economic value by genuinely caring about their people. Right now, I am so excited to be speaking with Jeff Kinsey, founder of the Logos Group and the backcountry business coach. Now, Jeff, tell us about what it means to be the backcountry business coach.
Well, Ariana, I'm so glad you asked. It turns out it's a fairly unique thing. I had no idea. I have always enjoyed being in the backcountry. Colorado, Washington, Oregon, California, any of those places that I've been around and lived and had reason to be in. I've always really appreciated the peacefulness that you experience in the backcountry. And when I started getting into coaching after 20 years working on Wall Street, I found that my clients really learned more about themselves when I took them into the backcountry. So it was this combo platter of being in a place that I really loved and also understanding what kind of benefit that would have around our understanding of thinking, our understanding of our relationship to the thoughts in our head. Wow. So I realized if I took professionals, leaders of any kind, out into the backcountry, I could really get them away from the boxes that they were so comfortable in, the devices, the relationships. I could get them out of that space where they only had themselves to rely on, and I could guide them through that sort of self-discovery of their own, so that when I took them back into civilization, they would really understand who they were as a human. They would understand that we're all humans. And then, fingers crossed, they would start to treat everybody that they interacted with as humans as well. And they would be better leaders, better fathers, husbands, wives, spouses, parents, whatever that might be.
Right. That makes so much sense. And I think that that's such a big part of coaching is bringing people outside of their comfort zone. And so you're doing so quite literally by bringing people into the backcountry. I mean, when you're in the backcountry, you are surrounded by the elements. If it's raining, you're getting wet. If it's snowing, you're getting snowed on. It's the sun's out, you're getting drenched with sun. So you're really bringing people out of that kind of comfort of their day to day by bringing them into the backcountry. That's such a cool way to expand and test their limits in their comfort zone.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. It's amazing to me that we evolved over the course of a couple 100,000 years in that kind of environment. Right. But it's only taken us, I don't know, maybe 100 or less to get so out of that environment that it seems kind of terrifying to get into it. And it takes us a little while to sort of readjust to our animal species, if you will, in that natural environment. And then we start to really get attuned to the benefits that we find in that space for us that are so foreign from the boxes and constructs that we live in society.
Right. Yeah. And so much more grounded, I find personally, when I'm in nature, that I feel more grounded and I feel like I have a more expansive view of things. I don't know if it's the lack of ceiling and walls and just being a part of that natural environment. But it takes that effort and like literally going over that threshold.
Right. Well, you mentioned comfort zones before. And it really is all about getting around, getting through, getting away from comfort zones. Right. Comfort zones tend to be these limitations that we have within our own heads, where our ego will tell us, don't go over there. It's scary and you don't know how to deal with scary. Right. To me, that's where you go, right? As soon as your ego tells you that's scary, that's where you go, right in that direction. Because that's where you grow, right? That's where you learn you can do anything. And when you're in the backcountry and every noise could be a bear, getting over that, getting really comfortable in that space can then be applied when you go back into the real world, if you will, and you realize that you can do anything, right? There's nothing to be afraid of, that those feelings of fear are just thoughts of fear in your head.
Right. That so resonates for me personally, and I imagine that it will for listeners as well. And I'm curious, as you mentioned this awareness that you bring your clients through, what your own personal experience has been navigating that relationship with your ego and the fears, and especially you mentioned before you started doing this, you were on Wall Street. So bring us back there. Like, can you stitch these pieces together of your own journey, kind of being working on Wall Street for, what was it, 20 years?
Yeah, 20 years on Wall Street.
Yeah,
You know,
and then shifting these gears into like the backcountry business coach. I mean, those dots seem really, really far apart. So connect them for us.
Yeah, they're a good 20, 25 years apart, actually. No, I think, you know, when I was growing up, I wanted to be an English teacher. I love language. I love reading. I love teaching, you know, and that was from a very early age, but that wasn't good enough for my father. You couldn't make any money as an English teacher. And to him, money was success, and he expected me to be successful. So I was young and impressionable, and I went into business school, and I got a business degree, and I joined a bank, and I went through a series of banks working on Wall Street. And I had a pretty good career with that, met some cool people, had a lot of fun. You know, when you work for JP Morgan in Citi, you have some pretty good expense accounts. So you get to eat fancy food and stay in fancy places. But it was this kind of soul sucking work that, you know, we would need to justify to ourselves that some life of fulfillment, that we were making rich white people richer. And that was what made it, you know, good work for us to do. But what I realized is I never really felt at home in that space. It was the land of fear and intimidation management, where you really tried to make people feel smaller than they were in order to get them to do what you wanted them to. And I just didn't accept that that's the way it was. So I bounced around. I worked for a couple different banks out of the East Coast. And I realized at one point that it just wasn't me anymore. And I just wasn't interested in being part of that. But it was a very challenging thing for me to go through because I had spent a career doing this. And the idea of starting over, you know, really wasn't very appealing to me. It made me miserable just considering that. And that's what really led me towards coaching.
So, so take us to that time and that place, if you can. Just, you know, you've had this long career, you were bouncing around from different institutions, kind of trying to find one that was less soul sucking, or maybe even regenerative, if that could be possible. But realizing this isn't me, this isn't what I want. But then I don't really want to start over again. What was that like, navigating that tension of the discontent with where you were in your career and the concern, the worry, the fear of going back to ground zero, it sounds like?
No, I really appreciate the question. And it makes me sort of remember in almost real time what the feelings were then, you know, that I was leaving this career that I had spent all this time in getting involved in. And part of that is that's all you know. You know, those are the only people you know that are in that world. And escaping from it is a very challenging thing. It's a community that doesn't want anybody to get out, because then how do they get out? Because we're all living in this same space. But I got out. I couldn't deal with it anymore. I had an opportunity to go create my own culture. It was really all about culture. I didn't necessarily appreciate the fear and intimidation culture that Wall Street banking was. So I had an opportunity to go help build a startup that raised money to build affordable housing. And I was the COO, which meant that I got to create my own culture. So I created an organization that was very flat and really flat.
Tell us what that means, in case people listening don't understand that vernacular.
Right. Well, it's a direct comment on hierarchy.
Right.
A non-flat organization, which is what most banks are, have 30, 40 levels of management. And I'm not kidding, 30 or 40 levels of management between entry level and CEO. That is a very pyramid-shaped hierarchical organization. A flat one is you just take that all the way down, get rid of all the management. You've got people that are really client-facing, that are doing all the work, and then you've got a very thin management layer over them, just making sure that the goals of the organization are being addressed, and that's the direction we're really moving. So I had the opportunity to create this culture that I had always wanted to be part of, where everybody was really equal. Everybody had a say in what it was that we did. Everybody was respected for their opinion. And we went out and tried to bring in as many people that didn't look like me, as few white males as possible, so that we could really take advantage of the diversity of and inclusion that comes with having a very diverse work population. And in building this culture that I really enjoyed, I got to really learn how effectively people can really work together. And the best part of it all is that we were raising money to build affordable housing. Right. Instead of trying to justify, how we were making rich white people richer, now we were giving people homes that had never had a home before. And that was a life-changing experience for me. I started getting involved in prison, teaching entrepreneurship in prison, getting involved in the homeless community, trying to build community within the homeless population. And it really changed the way I went out into the world and what I felt I could contribute to the world for this sort of second career of mine.
Right. That is so cool to hear. Kind of for you, that segue was this opportunity that fed this desire within you to create a culture that mirrored what you felt was the kind of place that people would thrive in together. And I can't help but wonder, it's for so many of us that are visionaries that see a better way of doing things. It seems so crystal clear in our minds, and then we start doing the work and it's different. There might be obstacles or things that we think will, result in a certain outcome that we might try to do, don't have that intended outcome. So I wonder if you have any experiences like that as you were developing this flatter culture and more inclusive culture. What challenges did you encounter or difficulties that you did not expect?
Yeah, no, that's great. Because in a way, this is something that gets talked about a lot these days, of having a very human-centric organization design. But this was 10 years ago or 12 years ago. That was pretty avant-garde at the time. I was fortunate that the leader of the organization didn't really want anything to do with running it. His forte was really developing relationships outside of the organization that could drive business into it. So that really left me with this playground, this laboratory to experiment within, of creating a culture that was really people-based, that I really felt good about. The challenges were, I didn't have any idea how to do this. I hadn't done this before. I had just really had a number of experiences of bad management, how bad things could really be. So all I knew was how
the anti-model.
not to do things. Yeah, exactly. I knew what not to do, but that doesn't always inform in what you should do.
Yeah.
So, and I was working in an organization in an industry that I had no experience in whatsoever. So I'm the chief operating officer. People are coming to me with questions that I have no experience from which to answer. So I became really good at asking them good questions, knowing that they had the answers within themselves. So we co-created this organization between us where I've got entry-level folks that are really passionate. I've got people that have been doing, crunching numbers around building affordable housing for 20 years, some real seasoned veterans. And we could bring this together and co-create an organization that we all wanted to work with. And, there were challenges all over the place, but we gave each other the benefit of the doubt that this was a growth opportunity, a learning curve that we were in the middle of. And it was okay if we screwed up every now and then, if we hired the wrong person every now and then, if we said the wrong thing every now and then. We would just learn from that and press forward. And it ended up being an extraordinary experience. That
sounds awesome. And of course, you're speaking our language here on this podcast, that you co-created the culture. And you mentioned that there were, of course, challenges and they were learning opportunities instead of, these major setbacks or fireable offenses, it sounds like. And so I wonder if there's any challenge in particular that comes to mind that you can share just to illustrate what it looks like to navigate as a leader that is co-creating, how to navigate that with your team in a manner that is humanizing and promotes growth and learning, and is different from what you experienced in your career prior.
No, I appreciate that. Because, the first thing that pops into my head is, this organization that we created had a parent organization that provided a lot of the funding and a lot of the support that we needed as we grew. And it was a much more traditional organization. So when you would go to them and say, we need X amount of dollars to hire somebody new, they would say, well, where's that revenue? It's like you already had to have the revenue in order to build the team, but that's not how it necessarily works. So it was really about being able to position the value proposition of the organization to the parent company. That, our goal is to have this many clients, to be able to do this many deals, to be able to build this many units of housing. And we need this team in order to do that. We need this team now in order to do that. Right. So there was a lot of negotiating and talking about, these are people and this is what people do. And this is why we need these people. We can't press everybody to work 14-hour days before we hire somebody to help them, because that leads to turnover. They're going to leave before we get to that point. Right. So if we know this is the organization we want to be when we grow up, let's hire the team right now to do that. We have the the luxury, if you will, of time, and that we're not totally pressed with an overwhelming amount of volume that you then have to hire into. That is not a great situation to hire into. We're all nice and relaxed and peaceful right now, right? We're at our best place to go out and find people that want to work with us. Let's go do it now. And we were pretty persuasive, and we were able to deliver every step of the way. We were able to deliver something to show the parent that we backed up what it was that we were talking about. It was all
Do you have any advice for listeners that are in similar circumstances where, they have a parent company, or could even be an investor? I think that this happens sometimes with investors, where there's maybe just a slight values misalignment in terms of what they expect and the kind of culture, that human-centered, empathic culture that the leaders want to create. How to best advocate for those needs to that other entity that might not see it from that same perspective.
Right. No, I love that, because that's the way it is. There's that whole idea that, what have you done for me lately before I give you money for tomorrow is the way the world primarily works. So it's a challenge, right? But, one of the things that I learned, one of the many things I learned on Wall Street was how to tell a good story. When you're on the sales side of things, it's all about telling good stories. So this is another story writing opportunity where you can explain to the money in the picture, wherever that money is coming from, that this is what's going to happen with that money. You can paint them this picture of reaching goals and achieving the greatest things and having a very progressive outcome at the end of this. If you give us money now, then this story will happen. And if you can bring people along on this emotional roller coaster where you're showing them how hard it is to do it now, and if you just had a little bit more, you could do all these things. When you bring them along and they buy into this thing, that's when there's some real beauty that happens in that space.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I love the way you said, kind of sharing the story, painting the story, but also using the numbers to tell a story that is compelling. I wonder, did you ever tell a story of, if we don't do this, then this is what the numbers are going to look like, and this is what's going to happen? So, or did you always just use that aspirational piece to advocate for the requests? Was there ever a little bit of, fear that came into the story?
Oh, that's always part of the story. I love that you asked that question. Because, a lot of this has to do with knowing your audience. Right. These sort of cliches that are so true, knowing your audience and meeting them where they're at, right? So if you understand that your audience is fear motivated, then throw a little fear into your story, right? Help them feel the pain a little bit of what's going to happen if they don't act, right? Always leave them in this place of joy almost, right? You're trying to create this position of joy because people give from that perspective. So, scare them a little bit in the beginning. If we don't get our act together, then, what you've put into this organization so far is going to be for naught. So give us a little more, and this is how we're going to spend this money, right? This is where we're going to be at the end of that. So we can avoid this fear-based experience by, coming along with us, and make it an adventure, a journey, a fun thing for them to do, keeping their risk tolerance in mind too. Not everybody's excited about stepping off the edge of a cliff with a parachute on kind of journey, right?
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes it's just walking down to the park is the journey. So knowing that and telling a story in a way that responds to that, resonates with them there is important.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think this makes so much sense and is so valuable and insightful for listeners, because I know, and some of my clients that I work with, are in established organizations, and so and old organizations, like really established, over 100-year-old. And so they have some cultural practices that are very old school, and yet they're trying to shift gears into a more innovative, heart-centered way of leading their team or their unit. And so to be aware of how to effectively advocate is such an important skill in navigating that change. You can't, try to persuade someone to think like you and assume they think like you, or you have to really meet them where they are at and use the different tools and mechanisms you have to connect with them in a way that's meaningful to them.
Absolutely.
I wonder, as you're, you talked earlier about the role of kind of the ego and how that becomes a source of tension for leaders, that bringing them out into the backcountry can help wash away that source of tension. I wonder if you have any personal experience yourself of being a leader and experiencing that tug of the ego competing with the needs of the collective, or the aspiration of a flatter organizational structure.
There's a lot in that question. And I think, maybe the way that I would respond to that is that, one of the things I really try and help leaders understand is the difference between the thinking they do and the thinking that comes to them. Right.
Tell us more. What does that mean?
Yeah, to me, we really have these two sources of thought, if you will. Mm-hmm. Our experience of the world in and of itself is based on thought. So everything we know, everything we experience happens because of the thinking that we do around it, right? But there's really two different sources for thought. One is our prefrontal cortex, or our intellect, right? Where we sit and we think and we churn. We've got this phenomenal analytical and computational tool at our disposal, but who's using that tool, and what else is there outside of that, just computation, analysis, and the ego is in there too, telling us that we're wrong, right? So we have to take that into account. And then there's this other space of presence and consciousness where thinking just kind of comes to us, right? So when we really struggle with trying to figure something out, a lot of times it's because we're limited by the information that's already in our head. We need fresh thinking. We need a source of clear thought. So if we can back out of our thinking process and sort of take a deep breath and avail ourselves to the present moment, these amazing things come to us. And we've all had these experiences, driving in the car, walking the dog, in the shower, where these incredible ideas come to us, and we're like, oh, great, God spoke to me today, or something like that. We're not always sure where this sound, or this answer came from, but it's us when we're not thinking hard, right? When we really relax, this thinking comes to us. So understanding that source of thought is available, that source of information is available to us, so that when we get all wrapped up and we can't figure it out, we can just sort of fall back into that space where that information comes to us there.
Right.
And knowing that, when it's the ego that's sort of beating up on us, that we don't want that to happen. All we have to do is take a deep breath, and then we can be separate from our ego, and we can, avail ourselves to some fresh thought.
And that's so relatable. And, the first thing that comes to my mind as you're describing that distinction is it turns out maybe we don't want to be like Winnie the Pooh, going think, right? Like that's the classic Winnie the Pooh moment. And it feels like we can get stuck into that place of just forcing the thought, trying to think our way out of a problem, versus the kind of listening our way out of the problem from within, as you described. And I know in my work, I call that really unlocking your innate leadership wisdom, or your inner genius, and learning to discern between the voice of your inner genius and the voice of your inner critic, because they both have entirely different motives and what makes them share their ideas with us, or thoughts come to mind. So what does it look like in action? Like, can you give us an example of having to navigate this distinction for yourself, of, a time where you were having this one thought and it was the, the thinking brain? I can't remember exactly how you described it. I know you mentioned the prefrontal cortex versus the kind of listening. What was that like for you?
The thinking we do and the thinking that comes to us.
Thinking we do, and I love that. It's brilliant.
I know my probably best example is when I first went out on my own as a consultant. It's not an easy road being an entrepreneur, being a solopreneur, selling something called coaching. That people, people aren't used to buying coaching. They're used to buying pants. Right. So they know exactly how to buy pants. They don't always know how to buy coaching. Right. So when I would come across frustrating experiences, my ego would tell me, this isn't for me. I need to go find another job. So I would log on to Indeed, and I would look around for something that, seemed to suit me and my skill set and what have you. And I would have this nauseous feeling, this somatic experience of just launching Indeed, that would tell me that wasn't for me. right? So then I would have to tell my ego, don't worry about it. I got this. This coaching thing is what I'm about. It's what I'm here for, right? This is what really resonates with me. And I would tell my ego, just go sit over there. I'm okay. And I would just be filled with this rush of clarity, of peace, that I was making the right decision. I was being true to me, right? Just by having that little conversation around what my ego thought I should do to protect myself.
Yeah.
And I would shut down Indeed and I'd call somebody. And I'd end up with a client at the end of that, right? So it was just really understanding what was happening when that voice was speaking to me, and that I actually had some control over that I could tell it to be quiet and just go sit down and leave me alone. And I would go on and from a place of presence. Yeah.
And what I'm hearing in that story too, is that you would have this thought, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Barking up the wrong tree. Who do I think I am? I mean, those aren't your exact words, but think that those can sometimes be the language that we might say to ourselves. And I know I've said to myself, and then from there, there's this action of, well, I'm going to look at Indeed. I'm going to look for a job. I'm going to do something to act on these thoughts and fears that my ego is saying. And as you take that action, then you notice your body reacting to that action with a very clear no, it sounds like.
Right.
Like, don't do this. This is not the path. And so it sounds like this really fluid dance and process of, you hear the ego, it instills some, oh my gosh, I better do something, fear. You start doing it, and that's listening to your body's reaction to those actions can also be a really good tale of shut it down. Don't keep going down this road. Stop and really recommit to the path that you've already chosen.
Right. I spent a fair amount of time helping my clients to really get attuned to their inner spirit, if you will. And the body has this amazing way of telling us what it really needs, whether we feel like listening to it or not.
Right.
And that's when the intellect is just going full speed, and that's this imposter syndrome, and where that's coming from, right? Is that voice in your head telling you you're not good enough, and overriding that or living with it, and then your body gives you this somatic experience of what's going on. It's like, hey, listen, this isn't what you're supposed to be doing. So really getting in tune with that and being able to make those kinds of decisions in real time is unbelievably freeing. I talk about, getting the grace out of life that you always thought was available to you. This is how you do it.
Right.
You really get in tune with where these different sort of senses are coming from, and your ability to sort of act in the moment to respond to them in a way that's most effective for you.
Yeah, and that makes so much sense. I know for myself, one of the ways I feel this is not aligned is this kind of retching feeling, like this, I just want to like reject it. My body just wants to reject it, or the constricting feeling around my throat. Just to give listeners some other examples of things you might notice, those somatic awarenesses that you might start to notice for yourself.
The shoulders get tight, the chest gets tight, the head can get tight.
The stomach gets tight too, right? Oh, I'm holding my breath.
Right. Oh, the holding your breath, that's always a good one. That's great.
So I wonder, your mention of this work you do, bringing that awareness for your clients, is a really good segue into, what does it look like to co-create now? You mentioned that you were co-creating this culture before, but as the backcountry business coach, what does co-creating mean to you in your work at this point?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. I think we have the choice from the beginning on whether to see ourselves as the victim of our circumstances or as a co-creator of our life, a creator of our life, really. That, you have the choice of taking the information from the outside and deciding what it means to you and how it affects you, or deciding that every moment you're going to create life for yourself. So I really try and help clients create for themselves as opposed to seeing themselves as victims. And, when you go out into the backcountry, it's this fantastic laboratory. There's nothing that we really know out in that space. There's nothing really to distract us from gaining this understanding that I have a choice. With every thought that goes through my head, I really only have one choice in life. It's how seriously to take that thought. If you just accept that that's what you have to deal with, how to take this next thought. And through that thinking, you create the life that you experience for yourself. Life gets really simple, really easy to be able to live in that space and to go out into the world after we get back into reality, right? Reality with all the life that you've created for yourself, to be able to see these things coming in from the outside and to respond in the moment to them in a way that's most effective and serves you best.
Wow, that's so beautiful, and makes so much sense to me to, really take on co-creating in that way of really creating that space and container for clients to learn to listen within and remove the noise through entering the backcountry.
Yeah, I think most people come to me with a transition in mind, a transformation for themselves in mind. They want to get to a different job. They want to get to a different level. They want to do something entirely different. They've been dreaming about their whole lives, kind of like me, right? They always wanted to be this, and they ended up being that instead. How do I get back to it? So it's really a lot of working with them to help them create what that vision really is for themselves. Right. To get all of the thinking, all the excess thinking, all the ego speak out of the way, so they can really get attuned to who they are and what's really driving them, their internal why, and then creating life for them from that space. I love it. There's nothing I like more than having clients get that new job, create their organization independently so they can move on and become something else. Right. To leave work as we know it all together and create their own consulting firm doing what they always wanted to do. Seeing them make those moves and actually achieve those lifelong dreams. Really, they thought about this when they were 4 or 5 years old. Right. And now they're in their 50s and they're like, how did I get here? I'm like, well, let's go back. Let's do it. And it's amazing to watch that happen. Yeah, that's so fantastic. And I wonder if listeners are wanting to get in touch with you, reach out, learn more about the Logos Group and the Backcountry Coach, what's the best way for them to do that? No, I appreciate that very much. Like you said, it is the Logos Group. So my website is thelogosgroup.net. And I'm Jeff at thelogosgroup.net if anybody wants to reach out to me by email. Fantastic. And we will, of course, include the links in the show notes. And, I can't believe we're at time already. It's gone by so quickly, and I feel like we could talk on forever. And we are at time, so we'll have to wrap it up. But thank you so much, Jeff, for sharing your story and insights and lessons learned with listeners. I think there's so many wonderful nuggets of wisdom in there. I can't wait for people to hear this and, for listeners to take into consideration, like just one thing maybe from this conversation that really spoke to you, that you found really inspiring, and identifying an action that you can take around it. What could you do to experiment with that new inspiration or insight from this conversation, and maybe share it with a friend, because we're more likely to accomplish our goals when other people know what we are striving for. So that's what I always encourage of listeners. And thank you again, Jeff, for joining us. It's been wonderful to have you today. Oh, so much fun, Ariana. Thanks so much for pulling me into this. Yeah, my pleasure. And if anyone wants to get other episodes of Co-Creators in Conversation, you can check them out at rosabellaconsulting.com, subscribe there, or subscribing on our YouTube channel, and you won't miss new episodes as they come out. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today, and be well.